Thank you for joining our monthly community conference call for March on the Pentagon. Today we have a special guest, Ben Norton. I'd like to thank you all for joining, and I'd like to thank Ben for joining us. Give a brief introduction to Ben. Ben Norton is a journalist, writer, and filmmaker. He is the assistant editor of the Grayzone and the producer of the Moderate Rebels podcast, which he co-hosts with Max Blumenthal. Ben's website is bennorton.com, and he tweets at Benjamin Norton. So, Ben, thank you for joining us.
Of course. Thanks for having me. Very glad to be here.
Well, you do some really important work. Right away, you and your colleagues at the Grayzone started writing about the crisis happening in Bolivia, and I know I've interviewed you about the crisis in Venezuela, which seems similar to what's going on in Bolivia. I want to ask you a question about that before you get into your remarks for us. What seems to me is the difference between Bolivia and Venezuela is, not the only difference, but one of the main differences is that, this coup in Venezuela that the U.S. tried to sponsor with naming, Juan Guaido as president, and which they've been trying to do for over 20 years. It hasn't been supported by the military, but my impression is in Bolivia, there were and are some elements of the military and the police that are supporting this coup d'etat against the legitimately elected president, Evo Morales.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say this is a lesson for what happens when the president, even if they're democratically elected, doesn't actually control the military. So I'm actually glad that you began the conversation here because it's a pretty enlightening distinction. The numerous coup attempts in Venezuela have all failed, going back to 2002. In April 2002, the then Bush administration backed a military coup that briefly ousted Hugo Chavez, the democratically elected president. And Chavez himself was from the military. He had strong support within the military, and his Chavista movement was birthed inside the military. So after being deposed, the military rebelled. Well, of course, thousands and thousands and thousands of people across Venezuela filled the streets demanding that their popular elected left-wing president be restored. And in response to that, parts of the military rebelled against the leadership and reinstalled Hugo Chavez. And before the coup, in fact, Chavez did not identify as a socialist. He didn't talk about socialism. It was, in fact, the process of the U.S.-backed military coup, also backed by the right-wing oligarchs in Venezuela, who controlled the gas company that was nationalized, who worked with some of the North American fossil fuel companies that he later kicked out, that Chavez kicked out. These were the forces that conspired to overthrow him, and it failed because he had a large support base in the military. Now, Evo is a very different case in Bolivia. Evo Morales was extremely popular, like Chavez, and won 3 presidential elections and numerous democratic referenda. But he came not from the military like Chavez, but rather from the countryside. He was a very poor farmer. He was a coca farmer, and Evo Morales emerged in the social movements. He was a farmer who began organizing in indigenous communities in Bolivia, who make up nearly 2/3 of the population. Even though more than 60% of Bolivians are indigenous, they have never had an indigenous leader in the history of the nation state of Bolivia since Spanish colonialism. And Evo Morales began organizing farmers. He began getting involved in the labor movement, much like Lula da Silva in Brazil, who was also from a poor family. Lula da Silva in Brazil lost one of his fingers when he was 19 in a factory accident. So these leaders, Evo and Lula, come from a very similar background, from a poor community, and then they enter the labor movement and become activists, and then they become leaders, and then the social movements form a political arm. In the case of Brazil, that was the Workers' Party, which propelled Lula to presidency, and then in the case of Bolivia, around the same time, a little after, these social movements coalesced into a party called the Movement Towards Socialism. But the name of the party, it's important. It's the Movement Toward Socialism. It's not the Partido Socialista, which is used by some groups, meaning Socialist Party. That's not the name they used, because the emphasis was always that this was a party that is a grassroots socialist aspiring party that is based in social movements, but it is a party that is ultimately, from the ground up. So while you might have heard some so-called leftists attacking Evo, claiming that he wasn't actually, that he carried out fraud and wasn't fairly elected. I mean, that's all ridiculous. And we can talk more about that later. I will get to that point, and I'll get to your questions. But the point I'm stressing is that Evo Morales, from the very beginning, was the definition of this term we hear today of democratic socialist. It's become, it's in vogue. It's a popular term. Oh, I'm a democratic socialist. Evo Morales was the textbook example of a democratic socialist. This was never about him supposedly overstepping democratic bounds. This was from the coup, and the coup attempts in the past against Evo were always because of his successes, not because of his failures. It was because he showed that you can implement these socialist policies and drastically cut poverty and expand social programs and nationalize your country's natural resources and use the wealth from those natural resources to benefit the entire population instead of a small elite. Those are the reasons that for years, and not just this month, but going back to when he was first elected in 2006, Evo Morales was continuously targeted by the U.S. and its right-wing allies in the region, internally in Bolivia being the right-wing oligarchs, many of whom are descendants of European colonialists, and as I'll discuss, some of whom are descendants of European fascists who fled after World War II because they were Nazi collaborators. And let's go back to 2006 here. So Evo Morales is elected democratically. He enters his first term as president. In his first term, he moves toward rewriting a new constitution. Bolivia voted on a new progressive constitution in 2009, which recognized the country as a plurinational state. And you might hear this term a lot, the plurinational state of Bolivia. That's an important term because, like I said, Bolivia, even though it's nearly two-thirds indigenous, has never had indigenous leadership. It was ruled by light-skinned elites who were descendants of right-wing oligarchs and Europeans. And Morales comes in and creates a new constitution, which in 2009 is voted on in a democratic referendum and gets about nearly 62% of the vote. So close to two-thirds of the population support this referendum. Evo is extremely popular at this point, and he's not even at his peak of popularity yet. Evo is also the first president in Bolivia's history to ever get more than 50% of the vote in a presidential election. Now, keep in mind, in the U.S., we were told that we supposedly live in a democracy. In this country, not even to mention the fact that the last two Republican presidents effectively stole the election or didn't actually win the election in terms of the popular vote, but even aside from, not that the Democratic candidates were much better, but even aside from that, the point is that Hillary Clinton, who got slightly more of the popular vote, she still only got around 25% of eligible voters, and Trump around 25%, because only 53% of eligible voters in the U.S. participated in the presidential election. And that's not to mention those huge number of people who have been disenfranchised because they're former felons or for whatever other reasons, which of course disproportionately targets Black and brown Americans. So by any metric, Evo Morales was an extremely popular, consummately democratic president by any measure. And in 2009, they passed this new progressive, radical constitution that guarantees all of these social services to Bolivians that we take for granted, not even take for granted, that we wish we could have in the U.S. Evo created a universal healthcare system that has been praised by the United Nations for helping to solve many persistent public health issues that had plagued Bolivia for many decades. Bolivia, under Evo, dropped the poverty rate. It plummeted by 60%, the extreme poverty rate by 62%, and then the overall poverty rate was dropped by over 40%. So these are just objective metrics that even the World Bank has to acknowledge. And this is an important point to make, that under Evo, the Bolivian economy, even according to kind of neoliberal capitalist metrics of GDP growth and things like that, which not necessarily are good economic indicators, because you can have GDP growth, but you can have rising inequality, which is what the U.S. has had for many years. But in Bolivia, there was massive GDP growth, and it was one of the most prosperous economies in all of Latin America. Even the Washington Post, the Bezos Post, owned by Jeff Bezos, the richest person on earth, who has $110 billion of wealth. Even the Washington Post, before the coup, actually surprisingly wrote an article about how Evo is an example of socialism working, and how it was so great, and how he cut poverty and did all of these great things and expanded education and fought illiteracy. So that's, of course, the reason that he was hated. And then even above all of that, perhaps the most important factor, aside from helping poor people, aside from representing indigenous people, is the fact that Evo Morales came in on the promise to nationalize Bolivia's substantial natural gas reserves. Now, this is a contentious issue that has really been one of the key contradictions, the key conflicts inside Bolivian politics for decades. In fact, the right-wing presidential candidate on October 20th, this past presidential election, which I'll talk about in a moment, the right-wing candidate, Carlos Mesa, who's basically a U.S. puppet, WikiLeaks U.S. government cables released by WikiLeaks shows that he was regularly meeting with and in correspondence with the U.S. Embassy, working together with Washington to try to destabilize Evo. He came to the presidency in the early 2000s because a previous right-wing president was ousted in a massive protest movement because he had privatized the natural gas reserves and was letting North American fossil fuel companies exploit Bolivia's very substantial natural gas reserves. And basically all of that wealth was going abroad and then to the hands of a small number of elites, mostly in the city of Santa Cruz, which is the richest and biggest city in Bolivia. It has the smallest indigenous population and is the major base for the right-wing opposition. So in the past, there had already been a president who had been ousted over protests over control of the gas reserves. Those protests were largely led by the indigenous, who make up the majority of the population and the majority of the working class of poor people. So naturally, they wanted the natural gas to be nationalized so they could benefit from those natural gas reserves. So Evo Morales comes in on a movement demanding that as one of the key planks of his presidential campaign. He wins on a landslide, and U.S. government cables released by WikiLeaks show that even before he was president, when he was campaigning and becoming an important leader, the U.S. Embassy was already funding and helping right-wing opposition groups controlled by these oligarchs, many of whom controlled the gas companies and benefited from them, to try to undermine and destabilize Morales. So USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is ostensibly an aid organization, the U.S. claims it to be, it's actually just a vehicle for soft power used to push regime change against enemies of the U.S. in countries not only like Bolivia, but in Nicaragua and Venezuela, in Syria, and countries throughout the world. USAID funds right-wing opposition groups under the name supposedly of being aid, but actually, it's the thing that the CIA did when the CIA was created after World War II, famously rigging the 1948 Italian election to prevent the Communist Party from winning. So it's the same kind of tactics. The USAID is basically a CIA cutout. And from the very beginning, before Evo went in, the U.S. was trying to unseat him, but he was so popular. And people, even parts of the military, which I'll talk about, were so frustrated with the decades of neoliberal rule of these right-wing capitalists who basically just looted the country and no one benefited from it. So Evo comes in, he creates the plurinational state, which recognizes the indigenous communities for the first time. It also, the Constitution recognized 36 indigenous languages, and created a dual flag. So if you look at Bolivia, at all government buildings and on the uniforms of police and military, there are two flags, the national flag of Bolivia used for many decades, and since 2009, the Wapala flag, which looks kind of like a quilt, and it's like a rainbow quilt with white squares as well, and it's a square flag instead of a rectangle. The plurinational state recognized both of those flags as the dual flags of Bolivia. And that's important because since the coup, these right-wing opposition forces, who I'll talk about, have been burning the Wapala flag, which is a blatant sign that they want the indigenous communities to just get out of life in Bolivia. They want them to go back to the countryside and the mountains and just leave the rich elites alone so they can continue ruling the country. There's also been video of military and police forces cutting off the Wapala flag from their uniform. So now, I know I don't have a ton more time, so in the next 5 minutes I'll talk about the coup. That's the background, and we can talk about any questions you have, but it's important to understand that Evo was always democratic. He was always extremely popular, much more popular than any leader in the U.S., which calls itself a beacon of democracy. And the U.S. was working from the very beginning, before he was even president, working with the right-wing forces to try to unseat him. Now, who are those right-wing forces? Because these are the forces behind the coup. I should say this is not hyperbole. They are literal fascists. Of course, the opposition has tendencies within it, and there are more centrist neoliberal elements like Carlos Mesa, who has traditionally been the U.S. puppet leader. He was the former president I mentioned who was the presidential candidate in this past election. I mentioned that WikiLeaks cables show that Carlos Mesa, who now works at a U.S. government-funded think tank in Washington, D.C., was also conspiring with the embassy and meeting with the charge d'affaires in La Paz, which is the capital, the de facto capital of Bolivia. Well, he had been the kind of preferred technocratic neoliberal who would pretend like he pretends to be on the left. His party claims to be part of the left. You know, he's like an Obama kind of figure. He says he's a progressive, but he's just going to let large corporations do whatever they want. He's going to privatize natural gas and also the lithium. Bolivia has 50 to 70% of the world's known lithium reserves. So this is another huge factor. Lithium is used in batteries. It's used in electric cars. It's used in every computer, every phone we have. And especially for folks talking about a Green New Deal and renewable energy, it's imperative to have access to cheap lithium, because the only way to make cheap renewable sources of energy, like solar panels and wind turbines, is having access to that lithium and electric cars. And that was also a factor in the coup in Zimbabwe. So Evo had been working on nationalizing the lithium. Of course, Carlos Mesa and these figures wanted to privatize it. But Carlos Mesa, at this point, is not a significant figure, even though he had been essentially the leader of the opposition. Who's in charge? It's the far right wing of the opposition, specifically the woman who calls herself the interim president, who declared herself president without a democratic mandate whatsoever, with no democratic legitimacy, without ever being elected president. Her name is Janine Áñez. Áñez is a far-right Christian fundamentalist fanatic. The first act she did after swearing herself in as supposed president with the backing of the military is she marched to the presidential palace with a giant Bible bigger than her head, holding it above her and saying, "Finally, the Bible is returning to the presidential palace." I mentioned that in 2009, Evo Morales created the plurinational state of Bolivia, which recognized indigenous people. It also, for the first time in Bolivia's history, made Bolivia a secular state. Before that, it had been a Catholic religious state. So these forces are not evangelical. They're far-right Catholics, kind of like the Francoist fascists in Spain in the 1930s who were allied with Nazi Germany. And the other major force behind the coup is a rich oligarch named Camacho, Luis Fernando Camacho. And he was the kind of muscle behind the coup, much in the same way that the muscle behind the 2014 coup backed by the U.S. and Ukraine were neo-Nazis. And they overthrew an elected president, Yanukovych. Now, unlike Evo, Yanukovych was not a leftist. He was pretty corrupt. So I don't want you to think that Evo is like Yanukovych, but the point is that Ukraine had a democratically elected president who was overthrown, and similarly, Evo was absolutely democratically elected. And the coup leader Camacho, who was the kind of violent leader, he was the bad cop to Carlos Mesa's good cop. Carlos Mesa kept going on CNN and Espanol and all the right-wing oligarch-controlled Latin American media, and he would say, I am against the violence, because this is after Evo Morales won the October 20th presidential election, which we can talk about with any questions you have. The opposition accused Evo of fraud without any evidence. There's no evidence of that. And basically the only good think tank in D.C., the Center for Economic and Policy Research, the economist Mark Weisbrot and some of his colleagues, they looked at the publicly available voting data, and they found no evidence whatsoever that there was fraud or irregularities, and showed statistically from a mathematical model, which has now been backed up by a separate independent scholar in Michigan. They have shown that there is no question whatsoever that Evo Morales won by the more than 10% needed to win in the first round of the election. The opposition claimed fraud without any evidence. The Organization of American States, which is basically a U.S. puppet, and we can talk about that, the OAS released a press release. It's been called a report. It's not a report. There's no evidence in it. They essentially released a press release claiming without any proof that there were irregularities and potential fraud in the election. The opposition seized that, and throughout this time after the October 20th election, for weeks, the right-wing opposition is rioting in the streets, burning down government buildings, burning vote boxes, preventing people from being able to count them in the future, and attacking members of the leftist movement towards socialism party. One of the most egregious acts carried out by these fascist mobs is they kidnapped a female mayor who's indigenous and cut her hair, covered her in red paint, attacked her, hit her, humiliated her publicly. And these horrifying videos you can find online. She was crying, and it's just horrifying. That was in the lead up to the coup. And Camacho is the bad cop. So Carlos Mesa is going on TV saying, I denounce the violence. We just want a new election. We don't want violence. And then Camacho saying, no new election. We want a change of the regime. And the U.S. is backing both of them, of course, because that's part of the good cop, bad cop strategy. And Camacho succeeds with the help of the military. They overthrow Evo. The military, led by a man named William Scaliman, who was trained at the U.S. military's notorious School of the Americas, and was also a military attaché for Bolivia in Washington, D.C., and of course he has a lot of this history before Evo even became president. He told Evo, essentially ordering him, you have to step down. Evo agreed to step down because he was worried of a civil war. He looked at the situation in Syria and Libya. He didn't want his country to go through a bloody civil war. So Evo, fearing for his life, also agreed to step down at the behest of the military, which is a military coup. So anyone who's saying it's not a coup, I mean, they're lying to you. It is blatantly a coup. And then Evo, fearing for his life, was spirited out of the country into Mexico. He originally tried to go to Argentina, but the right-wing president there, Mauricio Macri, refused to accept his asylum. So Evo went to Mexico, which now has a new progressive left-wing president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. So finally, concluding here, Camacho, the muscle behind this coup. Who is this guy? Camacho, as I mentioned, is from a right-wing oligarch family in Santa Cruz. Numerous members of his family, which is one of the most rich families in all of Bolivia, controlled the natural gas reserves and had large companies that were then nationalized by Evo Morales. Also, Camacho, like Agnes, the fake interim president recognized by the U.S., Camacho is a far-right Christian extremist of the Francoist Catholic fascist for Opus Dei kind of variety. And Camacho, it was formerly the vice president of an explicitly fascist youth group called the Youth Union of Santa Cruz. Right. And then he now is the president of the Santa Cruz business community, the Civic Committee of Santa Cruz. And this is also an explicitly fascist organization that is closely linked to many Croatian oligarchs that fled after World War II because they had been Nazi collaborators. So that's the overview of the coup. The last note I'll say is that, well, first thing I'll say is if you go to the Grayzone.com, that's Gray with an A, the American spelling, thegrayzone.com, you can find some investigative reports, one about Camacho and his support from Croatian, Bolivian fascists who are descendants of Croatian Nazis who fled after World War II and fled to Bolivia. And you can hear about Camacho. And then in another report that we published at the Grayzone, we look at how the leaders of the military that led this coup were trained at the notorious School of the Americas in the U.S. and Georgia, and also some of them worked with the FBI in a police training program. So that's the overview of the coup, and I'll be happy to take any of your questions.
Wow, thank you, Ben. That was really great background on this thing that's been developing over this past week. I know there was a lot of protests and things leading up to the coup that literally just happened last Sunday on the 10th. Were you surprised when it unfolded as it did last Sunday?
I was and I wasn't. So one fact that I didn't mention, which is a very important fact, is that Evo Morales and his intelligence services that he did control, they knew that a coup was planned and was coming. So one of the points I should have stressed is that this coup was not some kind of spontaneous so-called uprising. It was a planned military coup. It was a form of hybrid warfare. I say this for a few different reasons. One, the smoking gun. You know, I mentioned the fact that these people were trained by the U.S. The smoking gun, though, is that a month before the election on October 20th, back in September, there were 16 audio recordings that were leaked. And these audio recordings showed opposition members in Bolivia discussing how they were planning a coup, how they had support from the U.S. government, and specifically they named Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and Bob Menendez, and of course Donald Trump. So they had support from the U.S. They also said on tape, this is the opposition leaders admitting it, that they had support from the far-right fascist president and his government in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, and also the far-right government of Colombia, of Ivan Duque. Camacho himself, the coup leader, before the election, I show it in this report, I found out that Camacho met with Ivan Duque, the far-right Colombian president, in May to discuss how they can work together to unseat Morales. And then also in May, he also met with the foreign minister of Brazil. And then in August, Camacho met with the far-right Venezuelan coup mongers. So clearly, we have all this proof showing that this was a planned military coup. And then another point I'll say, which is a personal point. This summer, I spent nearly 3 months in Venezuela. And when I was in Venezuela in August and September, I was already hearing people, you know, not even just government officials, but journalists and folks who had their ear to the ground. They had heard that people were planning a military coup in Bolivia. I was worried that they were a little paranoid because, understandably, in case considering all of the coup attempts in Venezuela, people are a little paranoid, but they were right. And Morales himself, on October 15th, 5 days before the election, he did an interview, and Morales said, "We have proof that the opposition is planning a coup against me. Even if I win the election, they're going to try to overthrow me in a coup. We have audio recordings to prove it." He said that in an interview, and it was reported in mainstream media, which portrayed him as a paranoid wannabe dictator.
Right. Yeah. So there's been a few things over this past week when we've been trying to figure out what's happening, and you know, I particularly have posted your articles and other articles from Grayzone. But the one thing that a lot of liberals or leftists are saying in response to this is that the people voted against excuse me, him running again in 2019. Can you clarify that? And that's why people were so upset, because they were mad that he was, and I'm not saying that I believe this, but that he was becoming an apparent dictator because he ran for office again.
I mean, that's ridiculous. First of all, it's mostly true. I'll give it a little credit that he did lose the referendum, but let's provide some context here. Evo Morales had a referendum to decide whether or not they should get rid of term limits. Mm-hmm. And the referendum, technically he lost, but it was very close. It was basically 51 to 49. It was really like 50 to 50. It was an extremely close referendum that was eventually declared on behalf of the opposition, who didn't want him to run again for president. So right. The highest court, the effectively equivalent of the Supreme Court in Bolivia, who are democratically elected, by the way, they are not appointed by Evo. The Supreme Court ruled that he could run, and that the referendum was really close and it didn't really matter, and that he could run again anyway. So maybe you could criticize him for that, but it was not an illegal run. Maybe some people could say it was unwise, but the point is that under the constitutional law of Bolivia, the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, said he could run again. And again, I need to stress this point, because some of the smarter opposition people say, okay, well, yeah, the court said that, but he stacked the court. That's not true. Oh. Bolivia is one of the few countries in the world where people actually elect their judges, and this high court that ruled that he could run again, it has 7 members in this court, and 6 of them are voted on by the legislature, which is of course elected, and then one of the 7 is appointed by the president. So he supposedly stacked the court by picking one candidate. So what the opposition is essentially admitting when they say that is that the MAS party, the Movement Towards Socialism party, was so popular, and they had continuously they had 2/3 control of the legislature of both chambers. Because they were so popular, they were able to get a lot of this stuff passed. But that's not a sign that he was a dictator. That's a sign that he and his party were so popular that they were able to get this stuff through.
Right. I interviewed Hugo Chavez back in 2010, and I asked him that question because they initially didn't have term limits, and they had a referendum for that. Then they had another one that where they got rid of term limits. But he said, really, term limits are anti-democratic, because what if the people want him to be president?
Yeah.
But then he can't run because of term limits. And here in the United States, people are so, like, we have senators that have been senators for decades. We have people in Congress that have been, in the House, that have been in the House for decades. The only office that has term limits is the president. And so people look at that like not having term limits is anti-democratic, where you can argue that term limits are the things that are anti-democratic.
Also, I agree 100%, but even aside from that, what about the 47% of Bolivians who voted for him on October 20th?
Right.
Right now, everyone's saying ignore the majority, that's not the plurality, rather. The plurality of votes, because the closest candidate in the election got 36%, which is Carlos Mesa. So Carlos Mesa had support of around 1/3 of the population. Evo had support of around half the population. And that was in the first round of the election.
Well, then I see, like, Democratic, the stars of the Democrats, I'm not going to mention any names, but they're elected officials saying, well, the democratically elected president should be recognized. I'm like, well, he was democratically elected on October 20th. He was the one that was democratically elected. He's the one that should be recognized, and he's the one that should be restored to power.
Well, and another quick point here. Yes, you're absolutely right. But let's talk about the constitutional chain of command really quickly. I didn't even mention this point. According to the Constitution, the chain of command is presidency, president, if he steps down, it's the vice president. If the vice president steps down, it's the president of the Senate. Mm-hmm. Now, the president of the Senate in Bolivia is a young woman who is a socialist from the Movement Towards Socialism Party named Adriana Salvatierra. She constitutionally should be the president right now, but the military forces prevented her from entering the Senate that she was elected the leader of. They prevented her from assuming the presidency that she should be according to the Constitution, and they forced the man below her, who was the Senate vice president, also out. So Salvatierra has said, she physically tried to enter the Senate, and there's a video of her being attacked by military police forces. So they purged the president, vice president, president of the Senate, and vice president of the Senate, and this fascist Añez, she is the second vice president of the Senate. So they had to purge 4 people in order to finally get to an opposition candidate who they can claim is supposedly constitutionally allowed to declare presidency.
Wow. Okay, well, I do have some other questions, but I'm going to open up the Q&A. And are you okay to go a little bit longer?
Absolutely.
Ben? Okay, absolutely. I'm going to put it in Q&A mode. Okay, so if anybody has a question to get on the stack, you can press *6, and it'll appear if you have a question for Ben. And Ben, our people who participate are very. For some reason, Ben got muted. The people who participate usually don't talk so much. They're kind of shy. So I have another question to see while we're waiting to see if anybody else has a question, and that's *6 if you want to ask a question. You said in the beginning that the problem with the military is, you said that's the problem when the president doesn't control the military. And there was a really good article on Grayzone about the School of Americas, and that was my first question. When I heard about what was happening last Sunday, was how many of these people were trained at the School of Americas or, other CIA places like that. And so I posted that article, and some people were like, well, why would Evo surround himself with these people if he knew that they were graduates of the School of America? So can you talk a little bit? It's almost like saying, well, why would you wear that skimpy top if you didn't want to get raped? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Well, under Evo Morales, he kicked out the IMF and World Bank and North American fossil fuel companies, and he broke ties with the School of the Americas. He tried to do that. The thing is, let's think about this for a second. Let's make an analogy. If Bernie Sanders was elected president and there were forces in the military who were conspiring to overthrow him, why doesn't he just make a whole new military? It's that easy.
Right.
The thing about Hugo Chavez, once again, Hugo Chavez came from the military, and he was able to change the command structure of the military and create a new military. If you don't come from the military, and if you don't come in through a revolution, if you come in through a democratic election within the confines of a bourgeois democratic system, how are you supposed to remake an entire state institution like the military? And it's true that Evo did move around some of the leadership of the military, but one, he didn't really control it because a president is not a dictator. So these people are trying to have their cake and eat it too. They say, well, if Evo, why did he not get rid of the top command of the military? Well, he didn't have the power to, and you're calling him a dictator. If he was an actual dictator, he would have done that, but he wasn't because he didn't control large parts of his own state. So we even see this now with Trump, who's a horrible far-right bigot. I'm not pro-Trump, but it's true that his own intelligence services are undermining him. Because just because you're elected president doesn't mean you're the king. You don't control everything in a state. And there's such thing as a deep state in every country, including in Bolivia. And especially Evo as a farmer, as someone who had no experience with and support inside the military, he was not able to recreate that structure. And another point is that many of these trainings happened before he was president. And and even aside from that, just because Evo broke ties with the School of the Americas and other groups, Trump has ordered a lot of stuff, and his own military and intelligence services have just ignored his order. And they just continued doing what they wanted to do anyway. So Evo did order some of this stuff, and the military leadership continued doing it. There are also reports I should mention that the top generals of the military were bribed with $1 million each, and there are also reports that the individual cops and rank-and-file soldiers were bribed with $50,000 each. And we still don't know yet, but I think that's very likely. And if you think about it, in the U.S., that's not a lot of money, but in Bolivia, getting offered $50,000, let alone $1 million, you could be rich. With $1 million, you could live comfortably the rest of your life easily. And with $50,000, you can buy a house. That's a very significant, chunk of change in Latin America.
Right. So there's nobody on the queue to ask questions. Like I said, they're pretty shy. But I do have one other question, and then you can add whatever you want. So also, we talked about lithium already, and, the United States has been meddling in Latin America long before lithium was even an issue, before, computers and cell phones and electric cars, and it became such a hot commodity. But what role, and so people are saying that him giving the contract to China or something like that is within a few minutes he was overthrown. And so my point is the United States doesn't need anything like that to meddle in Latin America. They've long been meddling when it was bananas or coffee or, just to have, a stronghold in that part of the world. But what role do you think that played, the lithium question played in the military coup d'etat?
Lithium is definitely a significant factor, but it is not the most important factor. And this is true for many conflicts. For instance, the war in Iraq. There were many reasons for this illegal criminal war. Oil was one of them, and it was a significant one, but it was not the main reason. Similarly, oil in Libya was not the main reason. It was a significant reason. And the pipeline in Syria is a significant factor, but it's not the main reason. So I think we should have an economic understanding of wars. Ultimately, every war is about economics. There's no question about that. But it's also political and about power. And related to that is the ideological question, which is a material question, about destroying any country that poses a systemic threat to the U.S.-led capitalist financial system. This is true equally for Bolivia, for Libya, for Syria, for many of these other conflicts. Now let's keep in mind, throughout the Cold War, the U.S. didn't necessarily need to claim that someone was a dictator. They just said, you're a communist. So Arbenz, in 1954, the democratically elected president of Guatemala, who was not a communist by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, he repressed the communists in Guatemala. He was a social democrat who wanted to use the natural resources, specifically agriculture, in Guatemala to benefit the population, and was overthrown in a CIA coup in 1954. They called him a communist. Of course, Mossadegh in the year before in Iran, 1953, he was a progressive elected prime minister who nationalized the oil reserves. So the natural resources are a factor, but it's also the threat of a good example. As I mentioned, Bolivia had one of the strongest economies in Latin America. It had a very popular, self-declared socialist president who, his policies were not what some of us might call, very socialist. He was
Mm-hmm.
absolutely a leftist. He wasn't necessarily expropriating all of the wealth of the rich, but he did nationalize a large part of the economy. He did create all of these social democratic programs. And the U.S. financial system and the U.S. political system, which is controlled by the capitalist class and acts on behalf of the interests of Wall Street, Silicon Valley, the military-industrial complex, the IMF, and the World Bank, those are the rulers of the U.S. They are the financial arms of the U.S. empire, and they want to crush any government that doesn't submit, that refuses to kowtow. I mentioned Bolivia paid off the IMF debt and kicked out the IMF and World Bank, which have trapped Latin American countries in debt for decades as part of this neo-colonial strategy to prevent these countries from having sovereignty. They can't control their own economic system because they're trapped in billions of dollars of IMF loans, which the IMF uses to force them to impose structural adjustment, neoliberal austerity programs.
Right.
So, yes, lithium and natural gas, absolutely those are a significant factor. But let's not be economic determinists. Let's not think of it with our blinders in just this black or white view. It's a multiplicity of factors. Bolivia was also, under Morales, a strong supporter of Venezuela, a strong supporter of Cuba, a counterbalance against the Lima Group, which was the right-wing government in Latin America, refusing to recognize the coup regime in Venezuela. Evo Morales was a self-declared anti-imperialist who at the United Nations denounced the U.S. government in front of its own face after this supposed chemical attack in Duma, which is highly dubious, and now there's a second whistleblower from the OPCW saying that it was probably staged by these so-called rebels, these jihadis in Syria. At the United Nations, after this supposed attack, Bolivia's representative and Evo Morales himself denounced the U.S. and said, we can't trust this government after the WMD lies. They're trying to destroy the Syrian government. And the U.S. was furious about that. The U.S. bombed Syria in response to this fake allegation. So Bolivia was an important political leader pushing for a new, independent, sovereign, socialist pole in the world, in Latin America, working together with other countries in the global south to try to subvert and get around, circumvent U.S. financial hegemony and the IMF and World Bank. So all of those factors together are why, since he entered office, that was always why the U.S. was trying to unseat him, because they knew that if they want a puppet who will allow them to economically exploit the region, they want a right-wing neoliberal, and that's not what they have.
Well, and, Cuba doesn't have any large exploitable resources, but, the United States tried to assassinate Castro hundreds of times, and they're still 638
times.
Yeah, they're still trying to undermine it because of the threat of the good example and quote unquote communism. But also one of the things that's significant that the coup d'etat government has done is they're withdrawing from ALBA.
Absolutely. ALBA is an alliance created by Venezuela, which was an economic alliance of Latin American nations. And a quick point I'll make about this. This past June was the 10th anniversary of the U.S. coup against Honduras' democratically elected left-wing president, Manuel Zelaya.
Right.
And similarly, Zelaya didn't control his own military. And Zelaya was not a socialist. He was a progressive nationalist who was elected on a centrist platform and then moved to the left. And my colleague Max Blumenthal and Anya Harmful and I traveled to Honduras this summer, and we interviewed Zelaya. And he told us in our interview which you can find at the Grayzone and also on YouTube, he told us that he was told by the Bush administration, by John Negroponte, who was the Undersecretary of State who cut his teeth in the 1980s training fascist death squads.
Yeah.
In the dirty wars in Central America to kill socialists. And Negroponte was brought back in under Bush Jr., and Negroponte met with Zelaya and he said, you cannot have relations between Honduras and Venezuela with Hugo Chavez. If you have relations with them, you're going to face problems. And Zelaya said, I'm a sovereign leader. I can do what I want. He joined the ALBA alliance, the economic bloc led by Venezuela, which has a new socialist understanding of trade and says there's nothing wrong with trade. Trade is good, but what we should do is instead of trading based on profit, we should trade based on need. So Brazil has agriculture and Venezuela has oil. So Venezuela, we're going to give you oil, and in return, you give us agriculture. And we cut out the middleman of American banks. We cut out the middleman of North American companies, and we work together and build an economic bloc to integrate Latin America together against U.S. imperialism. And Bolivia under Evo was one of the few remaining countries in the ALBA alliance, and now, of course, they're leaving. So these are all factors that are absolutely linked to the coup.
Oh, thank you. We do have one question. I'm very excited. This is a new thing for me. So I'm going to pick that call. So if you're from the 407 area code, you press that you wanted to ask a question.
Hi, it's Tracy. My question is, I've been seeing images posted, excuse me, of indigenous or supposedly large contingents of indigenous protesting this coup, and I was wondering, what have you heard recently for making progress, or how that stands, or what that situation is?
Yes, there are huge protests going on. Of course, it goes without saying that Evo's largest support base is the indigenous communities there, and they have been leading large protests, and they've been massacred. So basically what's happening right now is the country is ungovernable. The military coup regime has very little popular support. I should mention, I forgot to say this earlier, Jeanine Agnès, who is the coup so-called interim president, her party got 4% of the vote in the presidential election. She's extremely unpopular. Again, she is the far right wing of the opposition, much in the same way that the U.S. picked the far right wing of the Venezuelan opposition, led by this young unknown guy, Juan Guaidó, which the real leader of that party is a guy named Leopoldo Lopez, who's an oligarch, who's extremely right-wing, has been involved in numerous coup attempts. So the U.S. strategy is, instead of picking, at least maybe this is the difference between a far-right administration like under, say, Donald Trump. This is also similar to what Reagan did, and maybe a Democrat. The Democrats would just choose the neoliberal capitalist Carlos Mesa, who's not a Christian fanatic fascist, but he's going to privatize everything and let companies control the country. That's not enough for the Trump White House. The Trump White House picked these far-right Christian extremist fanatics, and they are the ones who are now overseeing an extremely unpopular coup regime and have been ordering police and military forces to shoot these protesters. Hundreds of protesters have been shot. Dozens have been killed. And yesterday, Saturday the 16th, the so-called president, the coup leader Agnès, released an executive order, which is incredible. It's a Pinochet-style executive order that ensures impunity from legal punishment for all soldiers and police, saying that they are exempt from punishment if they violate the law in restoring order, as the order says. So what essentially it is carte blanche to kill anyone they want and to massacre protesters without any fear of repercussions. And by the way, this order was so extreme that even the Organization of American States, which, as I mentioned, is a complete U.S. puppet, nearly two-thirds of its funding come from the U.S., and which backed the coup, even the OAS released, in its so-called human rights arm, they released a statement saying, this is way too far, this is a blatant violation of international law and human rights standards, and this can't stand. So once again, we see how the same so-called liberal institutions that paved the way for this fascist-led coup, now they're trying to say, oh, well, I want to disavow the violence. But of course, the reality is that the only way for this coup regime to solidify control over the country is through extreme violence because it has no democratic legitimacy and because the population is rising up against it.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Tracy. So do you have anything else to add, Ben? We've kept you way over what I said we are going to. And usually our calls only last an hour, but I think that this was really important information that you gave us today. And like I said before, we will post it as soon as possible so more people can hear it. So is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, the last thing I'll just say is that the resistance movement is still very strong. And although absolutely this is pretty depressing, we shouldn't be distraught. Oh, distraught's the wrong word. We shouldn't be depressed and pessimistic because although we should be distraught and concerned, there's been a massive resistance movement, and this regime is extremely unstable and has no democratic legitimacy, just like the regime in Honduras. So even though this might look like yet another blow to the progressive pink tide in Latin America, I think the left is actually still fighting back in the region. And I mentioned Mexico has, for the first time in 50 years, a left-wing government. Argentina just elected a new left-wing government that has been supporting Bolivia and speaking out against the coup. And, of course, Venezuela is not going anywhere. Yesterday, on Saturday, there was another failed coup attempt in Venezuela. So although the situation is quite bad in Bolivia, there's a huge resistance movement, and they're not going to be able to destroy the entire movement overnight.
Well, the one thing that I know about spending time in Venezuela, and I did have a chance to meet Evo Morales with Hugo Chavez, very humble, nice, just a nice person, like Chavez was just a nice person, was that Chavez also came from a poor background. He did join the military, but, he grew up in a hut with a dirt floor, so it's not like he came from any kind of money either. But they empowered the people. They empowered indigenous people. They empowered people who had been traditionally disempowered and left behind by their government's previous alliance, mostly with the United States. So these people are empowered now, and we did see, like you said, some more pinkish people being elected in Latin America after there was a swing to the right. So there is a lot of hope, and it's what we do here as anti-imperialists in the United States is support the people and support their sovereignty and support their empowerment so they don't go backwards.
Absolutely, 100%. And the last thing I'll say is, on the same token, whereas many of these progressive leftist forces were united with similar programs to help the population, everywhere the right-wing opposition forces backed by the U.S. and billionaires, they all have the same program. So the same program that the coup regime is carrying out now in Bolivia is the program that the coup regime would carry out if they were able to take power in Venezuela if the military weren't loyal to the Chavista movement. They want to privatize all of the public housing, create the 2.7 million public housing units created by the Chavista government. They want to destroy all of these social programs, which is, of course, all the programs that were all destroyed, the few programs that we even had in the U.S. that have been dismantled over the past 40 years. So the right is united around the world, so the left should be as well.
Awesome. So it's this has been Ben Norton from bennorton.com and the Grayzone.com, right? Grayzone.com.
Yeah, I mean, ignore my personal website. The most important thing is
ignore that website.
Gray, thegrayzone.com.
And he's at Twitter at Benjamin Norton and on Facebook also. So thank you so much for taking this time and for giving us more time. Because, like I said, I think this was really super important.
Absolutely, Cindy. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for all the great work you're all doing.